And just want to say welcome. I hope everybody's having a great Wednesday, that you're uh, enjoying some of the changing freedoms, and that you're figuring out ways to survive and thrive through all the different changes that we have. Um, for our class tonight, we're going to talk about influence and why it matters, and why influence matters in the frame of reference of our class on being fueled by Christ and how we can power positive change in a divided and distracted world. So, really, tonight it's all going to be about influence, and the way that we're going to do that is we're going to I'm going to share some story time, and so um, I think if you were to look at the history of mankind, the history of humans, you would go back and you'd be able to find that the way that most information had been shared was through stories. And if you were to look back at um, historical context, again, for me, that's helpful in understanding things sometimes. And so, if you look historically, that's the way that for generations everything was shared up until the time of the printing press, and then people an element though. There are all of those things where storytelling and sharing stories is a way that helps people connect. And it's one of the tools that Jesus used very effectively. And not that I'm comparing myself to Jesus or anything like that. Please don't go there. Um, the I think using stories is really helpful. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm excited to be joining everyone. I will say that teaching during this quarter has felt more like a marathon in a way that I don't ever recall any of the other classes feeling. And I think it has to do something to do with the quarantine. And so if you're feeling a little bit like me, where all this stuff about the coronavirus and people impacted, people not impacted, people losing their jobs, people being furloughed, like all of that stuff, I think it weighs heavily on us in a variety of ways. And then I know that there's a whole nother context too, where people are concerned about personal freedoms and the right to assemble and things like that. So I really feel like there's a lot of stuff weighing on people, and I'm I'm not immune to that, much like many of you. So, anyways, so if you would, I appreciate you being here and your encouraging words. Those have definitely been helpful. And what we're going to talk about tonight on the topic of influence is where we're going to get to is, we all have levels of influence. So that's the goal that we're aiming towards. So I think that influence may be one of our least discussed, but perhaps most important traits. And when I think back to my time period in school, influence was often described and discussed to me and to children my age as peer pressure. That was kind of always the context of influence that was presented to us. It was, David, don't fall into peer pressure. We would have our DARE officers who were educating us about, the dangers of drugs and things like that. And it was, don't fall into peer pressure. Then there were other ways that people used it. It was like, David, don't let peer pressure make you do something you don't want to do. So when you're surrounded people your age and all those types of things, make sure that you don't succumb to those things. That was always the way that influence was presented to me in terms of peer pressure. Now, at the same time, there were often other factors involved, such as my brother, his friends, my parents, their friends, later in school life. Those were major influences. Later in life, as a teenager, it was church. movies, television, music, video games, work. Um, all of those things were balanced against what I wanted to do in life. So I had all of these things where people described it to me as peer pressure, but then I felt like there were all these other things that were interacting and exerting pressure on me personally. And those are some of the things that I listed, but all of those were balanced against what I really wanted to do in life at that time, which was I wanted to survive my home and school life. Like I did not like elementary school. I didn't like junior high. I didn't really care for high school. I felt very fortunate to go through those things as far as like, I got picked on a lot in elementary school. We were poor, had really terrible plastic glasses, never got my hair cut, like just a whole bunch of things that were really, really things that I don't like to think back on took place during those time periods. And so for me, the way that I could envision something different was escaping, and that was going to college and graduating and getting a degree and living in a better situation than what I grew up in. And sometimes you'll hear those stories, and people will talk about. Normally, where you hear those types of stories is from professional athletes, where they talk about all the different things that they went through and how they had to leave their friends and other people behind because they were trying to be an athlete and get out of whatever their community was. Well, for me, um, the way that I saw being able to be the best me was to get out of my home and school life, go away to college, graduate, get a degree, and live in a better situation. In fact, that desire to go to college was probably one of the biggest pushes I had in my life, like from a personal standpoint, outside of converting to Christ as a 13-year-old. So all those things were constant pressures for me. And when I was a freshman in high school, I discovered that my academics were more likely to get me to college than sports. And up until that time, you can go to any school you want to go to. So I immediately quit playing sports in school. And that was something that was like a choice that I made as a ninth grader because my whole vision and my whole mission at that time was to get into college and to graduate. Um, I also worked whenever I was in school, and I'm sure many of you have done the same. But there was a point in time where I was asked to work more and more hours when I was in high school, and it started getting in the way of my grades. So I would get out of high school, I would go straight to my job at the local grocery store, and then I would work until 9, 9:30, 10, 10:30, depending on which area of the store I was working in, and if they had any produce trucks or not produce trucks, but grocery trucks or dairy trucks. And it started getting in the way of my schoolwork. And so at the time, I looking back now, what I was asking for, it's kind of amusing, but I asked for a leave of absence, and from my job as a high school student there at the grocery store, and the managers were nice. They definitely let me do that, and I just refocused on my schoolwork at that time. My grades were slipping, and to me, again, that was the key for what I was working towards. It was a huge influence on my decisions. Um, Later, when I went to try to go to school, many of you know that I graduated from Oklahoma Christian University, which is a private Christian school. But when I first applied and tried to go there and did a school visit and visit with the financial aid office, they told me that because of my aunt and uncle and how much income they made, that they would have to pay for my school, and basically that just wasn't going to happen. And so when I learned that, it was pretty devastating. And so I thought, well, I can go to a different school, et cetera, et cetera. And then I thought about, what are the other options? And so I went back and I visited with the financial aid office and explained to them my situation. as far as, hey, these aren't my mom and dad. They never legally adopted me. Like, they let their nephew come and live with them from the age of 13 to 18, and they didn't plan for me. Like, is there any other options that I have? And so we're able to find a way to do that. And part of that was through student loan debt, which I have, and I'm not afraid to say it. People can have their different opinions about it, but half of my school was that, and half of it was scholarships and grants. And it was it was something that I took very personally and a very sincere approach towards it. And then whenever it was class selection time, you always had to get your academic advisor's approval. And so I would schedule time immediately. Like the first time that you could have available, I would have that with my advisor so that I could do all my classes and get through my school studies within 4 years so that I could maximize as much as my time as I could while I was there. And the way that some of the smaller schools work is not every semester are certain classes offered. So sometimes you have to figure out, when they're going to come. But all of that, I'm sharing all of that to say that my desire, and my focus at that time was to figure out a way to get to college and figure out a way to graduate. And because of that, there was a level of influence that impacted all of my other decisions around what I was trying to do, from working, from extracurricular activities, all of those things. On the other side, I also chose not to participate in a lot of high school activities because I felt like I was trying to be like Christ. I was trying to live the things that I saw in Scripture. And so there are a bunch of different things that I didn't participate in then in high school that I still don't participate in. And I'm not saying that to say that I'm perfect, because I certainly am not. I wasn't then. I'm not now. Not even close. But being a Christian influenced my behavior significantly. It shaped my worldview then, and it shapes it now. So really, again, the point in sharing this aspect of my story, or this element about myself, is to help prepare our minds for the very powerful understanding of influence. If you were to go do a Google search of influence, you'd immediately get a couple of hits right off the top. And now that the way that they do things, I think we talked about it in one of our other classes with some definitions, but the first elements are right there at the top, and it talks about influence being a noun, which talks about the effect on character, development, or behavior of something or someone. So it's exerted force that impacts the character, development, or behavior of something or someone. That's what influence is. And I would say that if we were to go around a room, we'd probably agree that there's a pretty easy definition for us when it comes to influence. Nowadays, you probably hear about people talking about others being influencers online, and they have a large following or they're well known, and people merely mentioning some type of product or some type of service or whatever. These type of people have the ability to make or break events. They have the ability to increase the sales of items. They can shift public policy. There are different aspects of this. So, in light of all of this, I thought it would be good for us to look quickly at the way that influence could be perceived or seen in Scripture. So one of my favorite things to do, and I'm not sure if you're like this or not, but one of the favorite things I like to do sometimes is I like to look at glossaries and indexes at the back of books or the back of reference books to get an idea for where, if I wanted to quickly look at something, where I could go and try to figure something out or get some ideas or concepts or just review or refresh. And if you do that with the term influence in Scripture, you really won't find anything. So to me, that's one of those things where you can read about it, but it's not necessarily like specifically spelled out. And if you happen to have a translation that does spell it out, feel free to share that with me. You can send it in the comments box, and I'll check it out later. And I'll look at the different translations that you suggest. But really, I think it's quite easy for us to look at Scripture and see the way that influence works with people and with the different elements that we see. So one of the favorite places for me to do that is to look in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. And I think if you go to those two sections, you can definitely see the power of influence, both in the writing of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, and then some of the different Proverbs, more than likely written by Solomon as well. So if you were to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and that's what we're going to do now. If you turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, you can read probably one of the most famous verses about, friendship and cords or ties that bind or those types of things. So Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and I want to make sure I get this right. Ecclesiastes 4, starting in verse 9, says, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they'll keep warm, but